Speakers have canvassed a whole range of issues from port, road, those sort of access issues right through to competition around supplying supermarkets and all those sorts of things. So quite a wide-ranging, even though we sort of talk glibly about competition policy and think it's a narrow bit of policy, it's actually quite wide-ranging and quite a lot of implications around the agriculture sector. I'm going to lead off with the Chairman's question. One of the things that strikes me about competition policy, and I'm speaking very generally about it, and our approach to competition is that it seems as if in Australia we take the approach of having to catch someone out, and when we try and do that, it's the lack of information often that makes it an extraordinarily slow process that takes a long while to get to the bottom of. And yet when we look internationally, the approach of governments there is a lot more around transparency and margin analysis and understanding changes that are occurring in the market, and also, as I think Joseph Stiglitz suggests, allowing that information transparency to be an antiseptic that keeps the markets a little bit cleaner than they would otherwise be. I'm just wondering the views on the panel about whether that's something that's been left out of consideration when it comes to competition policy in Australia, that if, for agriculture's perspective, if we had better market information and better understanding of pricing in markets, whether in fact that might not solve some of the issues that we're trying to deal with. Anyone who's game.
Oh, definitely. Exactly what Sue said. I'd take any lead in I could get to talk about that. I mean, that's really what we have in mind with the market studies advocacy role. Just about it, I mean, most of our counterpart agencies are active in competition advocacy. Whenever I go overseas to the network of competition regulators, there's 110, 120 of them. They have a session on cartels, a session on each of the things you'd expect, and they have a session on advocacy, because that's what each of them do, except we don't have that role in Australia. So we are way out of kilter with our overseas counterparts. The rule in Australia is they want the regulator just to regulate and not be a competition champion, and not to look at sectors and say, well, if we could do this or do that, things would improve. We want the ability to do that. I mean, whenever I make comments that look like I'm advocating things, I always get jumped on because people say it's not your role. Fortunately, I'm old enough to disregard that, but it would be helpful to get a bit more backing for that, a bit more of a mandate to be able to do it. So we're very keen to do that. As Sue has said, the panel wants to give that role to a new agency. Our point is the skills you need to do it are the skills we've got, but ultimately be up to government. Don't know whether Sue wants to comment on that now.
Look, more broadly, I think we would certainly support transparency of information, and that's really important. The market studies could only go one part of the way towards doing that, but I think the industry itself, the extent to which we can get better information in Australia and make sure that that is transparent, of course would help. And you know, you always want to try and look at an approach where you can have a carrot rather than a stick, and that then helps make a marketplace where each of the players can actually operate far better than needing to actually think that you've got regulation that needs to be, you know, that lever needs to be pulled. Just in relation to what we've said about the market studies and the ACCC, for us, I guess the panel has actually believed that we do need to separate those roles of advocacy and regulator, and let the regulator actually focus on regulating. Resources are always tight, and we just think that there is just a bit of a conflict between the two, and that's why we've recommended, you know, separating those functions.
How are we going?
Can I just add something on? There's a current example that's very topical, that's relevant to that point, and that's in the domestic gas market, which was mentioned in the morning session, and the looming price spike when the export LNG trade starts up later this year, next year, which is phenomenal, going to be phenomenal for Australia's export performance. But the issue is not that there's not enough gas. There's plenty of gas. The issues are around constraints bringing it to market, and inadequacies in the domestic market around transparency and information about pricing and supply and retention leases and so on that allow suppliers to sit on the gas. And so we've certainly been advocating in that sector the need for exactly what you're saying. We're not particularly hung up on who does it. We actually suggest the ACCC do it. But certainly there's a need in that area. I think that's a very topical one at the moment.
Okay. I've got a question at the front here.
Michael Southam, Grain Growers. My question's for Gary. Gary, when you were developing the prescribed code, I didn't pick up whether there was an existing voluntary code beforehand. If there was, why didn't that work? And if there wasn't, why didn't you look at a voluntary code to start with?
Well, what we're looking at is a prescribed voluntary code. So in a sense, it's a midpoint between those two things. It's a voluntary sign-on, and Coles and Woolworths have both committed to signing on, and there's discussions with other retailers around it. But once a retailer signs up, the obligations are binding within the code, and they can opt out completely at some point, but they can't opt in and out of particular parts of it. So it's called a prescribed voluntary code to try and capture that. We felt that was a better approach than trying to go for mandated intervention in this market. It is a dynamic market. It's impossible to foresee all the things that can happen in it. And that's why we opted for that, and the retailers were up for pursuing that or committing to that as an option. But it doesn't require its own piece of legislation. It is a regulation under the existing Act, and therefore is lighter touch than mandatory intervention. I don't know if you want to.
I'll just add that there is a current voluntary grocery code. Right? No one's ever heard of it. It's completely useless because it's completely voluntary, and therefore, it's like most things in life. If you want to do it, then give it teeth and make it meaningful. The current grocery code has neither.
Okay. Yes, we've got a question right in the middle to Kylie.
Thank you. I'm Mike Shaw from the Australian Chicken Growers Council. So I suppose I'm very interested in the comments about the review of collective bargaining arrangements, because I'd say the chicken growers are one of the main users of the collective bargaining provisions. So I'm very pleased to see that you're reviewing the issue of boycott provisions and how and where they can be applied. I think that would be a very important reform. So I've got two questions. One relates to another issue in collective bargaining where a farmer wishes to join a collective bargaining group and the process or organisation that group is trying to negotiate with denies that farmer the right to join that collective bargaining group on the basis that they won't offer an ongoing arrangement with that farmer if he joined that group. So that's a significant weakness in the collective bargaining process from our perspective. I'm also interested, there's been some discussion today about consumer choice and how I think Anne has even said that consumers perhaps should be the determiner of standards going forward. And what we've seen, without wishing to get into supermarket bashing, but what we've seen in recent times is the supermarkets becoming the determiner of what standards they wish to stock in their stores, and they're doing that on an exclusive basis, which to my mind denies consumers the choice to make it. And I'll give some examples. In the chicken industry, you can have free-range chicken, you can have barn-raised chicken, you can have chickens in cages which lay eggs, and they all should come at different price points. And in a properly operating market, you should see farmers being able to supply those different products at the appropriate price points, and consumers making the choice of which of those products they wish to purchase and a market reflecting an appropriate price. But we're seeing supermarkets now bring in unilateral standards across their stores and restricting farmers' ability to supply different products, and we're restricting consumers' ability to buy those products. And I think that's really a challenging issue that needs to be addressed going forward. So I'm interested in the panel's thoughts.
So the first question was on the, it's all right, the first question was on the arrangements around collective bargaining and the ability of someone in that collective bargaining arrangement to prevent others joining it. Who's Rod, I suspect?
Yes, well, look, I mean, we've got a number of changes that we've proposed, which I think picks up that point. And we're going to put those back to the Harper panel. I think this is one area where the Harper panel looked at it, but we're going to urge them to look at it in a lot more detail because it's very important. We had a lot of quite detailed recommendations. I mean, we've been involved in collective bargaining for as long as the Act's been there, and there are serious deficiencies, and so we're going to urge all of our recommendations on the Harper panel, excuse me, I think it will pick that up. Excuse me. I think the collective boycott is really important as well, though. I'd really urge the farming community to get behind that. Sorry.
We might give the others a go on the issue of unilateral requirements and standards with access to retail shelf. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think this is an issue, and effectively the retailers, by their decisions, mandate standards right back up through the supply chain on processors and producers, depending on what it is. And it's not just an example like the one quoted, but it raises additional issues for suppliers where there are different standards between different retailers and different quick service restaurants, for example, or food service companies, to the point where suppliers are faced with 5, 6, 10 different audit requirements, and the cost of that multiplies dramatically. We're doing quite a bit of work on this at the moment to try and establish mutual recognition of core standards around food safety and where there are agreed requirements around sourcing, for example, to try and at least get some consistency across supply chains to minimise that cost. But it's increasingly cropping up because these are often things that are used as for competitive advantage at the retail end, but the costs are pushed up the supply chain, and there is potentially a loss of consumer welfare if choice is denied.
I'll just make a comment on both of those. In relation to collective bargaining, look, we welcome any additional recommendations or the changes that we can make in relation to that draft report. As I said, I don't think we've had enough come through in what we had to put in the draft report, so we're really encouraging more input in that area. On the consumer choice, you're right, where you've got sophisticated markets, you've got a greater ability for the consumers to exercise choice. And for example, in the cities, you'll see major supermarkets, and outside those major supermarkets, that's where you'll see the butcher and the baker and the florist, because people are exercising that choice. It's where you have thin markets that becomes a challenge, and that's where consumer choice, really, we've got to think about access and equity there. We're quite conscious of that. The thing is, it is difficult to have one rule for one and a different for another, but we're at the moment trying to just grapple with that balance between what you would put in place that has an impact on a marketplace, which is quite different when you look at a metropolitan type of market to a very thin market out in regional or remote areas.
Okay, how are we going? Right down the back.
My name's Colin Bell. I'm a rice grower from New South Wales. I think this has been a great panel discussion because I love competition. And in the rice business, there is not competition, and I would welcome it sort of being introduced to it. Gary Helou, who spoke very well last night, he was the CEO of Rice Growers until a couple of years ago. The point is, I think I'm addressing this question to you, Rod, sorry about that, but maybe Sue can help. But every 4 years, the New South Wales government determined that the rice crop for every year will be vested in, they've set up a thing called the Rice Marketing Board. And the Rice Marketing Board has as directors of Sunrice or rice growers. And they, unsurprisingly, award the annual export entitlement to rice growers. So 100% of the rice that's exported from Australia is through rice growers. So it is, in every sense of the word, a monopoly. But of course they don't call it that, they call it, it's orderly marketing or something like that. But you know, we know these weasel words, but what it boils down to, it's a monopoly. And they really have a monopoly over the milling of rice, because unless you're able to access the export market, it's very difficult to justify the building of a rice mill. The point, you would build a rice mill and access the domestic market, which is, they would say it's openly competitive, but you can't get into it unless you have a mill, and you can't build a mill unless you've got access to the export market. And I sort of, and every year it comes up, every 4 years it comes up, we sort of go to the New South Wales government and sort of plead our case. But maybe, Rod, we should have gone to your guys and pleaded our case.
See how the voice goes. Look, I think two things can deal with this. One is the recommendation from the panel that talks about governments being subject to the Act in trade or commerce, rather than just their involvement in a business. I think that will make their decisions more open to challenge under the Act. But I think more relevant is that competition advocacy question. It would focus a lot on what governments do. As I say, our counterpart agencies overseas would be looking at those sort of things. We don't have that mandate. And so I'm going to be asking the Harper panel to explain why we're different to overseas countries, and they can take that one on notice. But I think that really would deal with the problem and try and address those issues.
And look, the panel absolutely agrees with you. We've got a recommendation in there where we've recommended lifting those restrictions. The same as we've said, remove the Potato Marketing Board in WA, where you can only eat certain brands of potatoes, sell certain brands of potato, certain varieties. We've actually said that those sort of constraints shouldn't be there and they should be lifted. But as I mentioned earlier, that's only one part of the story. We can recommend it. The response from government can be, this is a no-brainer, and then the politics plays a part. So it's probably the rice growers that you might need to be speaking to encourage them that and help them understand that competition is actually healthy and will be to their benefit in the longer term.
It's not like you to be not persuasive, Colin. Okay, how are we going for questions? Pretty much finalised. There is one, I'm going to come back again. One of the things that strikes me in the discussion about competition policy is the ultimate objective, which is consumer benefit. And it strikes me that you can justify slavery on that basis. You know, consumers would be better off if all farms were slaves and we had to turn out our products for free. There obviously needs to be a wider dimension to the objects of consumer or competition policy, and perhaps it implies more along the chain rather than just the consumer. And I just wonder whether that is a missing aspect of our competition policy as well.
Look, it is there. It's there in the public interest test. So where we say we put consumers very much at the heart of this, underlying every provision there is, it must be in the public benefit. So there would be reasons where you might say that you would need to actually restrict competition because it would not be in the public interest if you didn't do that. So that does underpin.
So the public interest is more broadly defined than consumer interest.
Yes.
I think the other one of the things we really liked in the draft report from the Harper Review was an acknowledgement of the long-term consumer interest. In other words, we interpreted that as that the consumer interest is about more than just price, that consumer interest might go to choice, it might go to longer-term interests around innovation and investment and so forth. And because that's the argument we're often up against in the retail space, where we've had retail price deflation for 4 years, which is great for consumers. But if there's a chilling effect on investment and innovation and choice, which clearly there is at the moment, then in the longer run, there's a question about how that balances out.
I agree.
Okay, looks like we've exhausted our questions. No, we've got one right, two. We'll go to the back first.
Claire Miller, I'm the Manager Policy Strategy at Dairy Australia. This is not really a question, it's actually a product plug. Dairy Australia has produced a guide to collective bargaining for dairy farmers. It's on our website if you'd like to have a look at it. I'd highly recommend it. Thank you.
And I think we had a question in front of you, Ross.
And while the mic's coming down, I might actually respond just in relation to the dairy sector, where you've actually got cooperatives operating really well. We'd love to know if cooperatives and the promotion of cooperatives could actually be a way to help, once again, get that collective bargaining impact and market power.
Yeah, I've just come back from Canada, and one of the institutions in Canada that I found interesting was a legislative body known as Quorum Corporation that has an ongoing legislative role in monitoring all the parts of the Canadian grain supply chain. And because they regularly provide data, my understanding is that data is often then used when it comes to court cases involving participants in those supply chains. So a question maybe to Rod, in Australia, is access to data an issue? Do we have sufficient information available about agricultural businesses that can be quickly accessed and drawn upon when it comes to litigation? Or is the quality and quantity of information detrimental to the development of competition?
Sorry, my own view is there's inadequate data, not just for what we do, but just to help people in the supply chain go about their business. The bigger entities have got more data than others have, so I think the more we can get that data out there and readily available, the better on a general front.